James Waller serves as the Cohen Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College in New Hampshire. The institute, which also carries the Cohen family name, is going to begin including graduate students next year as well, which is an especially important development, not just for Keene State, but for the work that so many of us do. In addition to the courses he teaches at Keene State, Professor Waller is also the director of academic programs for the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. In addition, he's been much in demand as a consultant to institutes in this country and abroad. He's spoken to the United States Army, to divisions of the State Department. Recently, he's been spending time in Ireland as well, Northern Ireland. He's the author of several notable books. I'll call your attention to one in particular. Its title is Becoming Evil, and the subtitle is especially pertinent for our concerns: How Ordinary People Commit Genocide and Mass Killing. It's a key text for understanding perpetrators and what makes them perpetrators. I always call it to the attention of my own students in teaching about the Holocaust. As we all know from every day's headlines, we're living in very overwrought times. Extreme groups of a number of different kinds have come to the fore, often accompanied by violence. And James is going to help us understand how anti-Semitism, one form of contemporary hatred among too many others, exists within this frame. The context he'll be providing will be illuminating for sure. Jim, it's my pleasure now to hand over to you.
Thank you, Alvin, and thank you, Gunter, for the kind welcome and the opportunity to spend time with you today. And welcome to all the participants. Look like it's nearly 100 of us who have come together today, so thank you for taking the time to be here. I'm coming to you from a beautiful, crisp fall day in New Hampshire, original home of the Abenaki and Pennacook people. As Alvin said, I have the privilege here of holding the Cohen Professorship in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Today's talk, though, is going to focus specifically on issues of escalating risk of mass violence in the US. So I will share my screen with you now. Gunter and Alvin, can this come through okay? Perfect, thank you very much. So again, thank you all for taking the time to be with us here today. If you live and work in the US, you recognize the importance of this question for us. If you don't live and work in the US, I think I would still argue that as a case study, while there's a lot to learn about the escalating risk of mass violence in the US, there's also a lot to learn from it. So I think many of the things that the US is struggling with as a country today in terms of increasing the potential risk for mass violence, as I'll argue, many countries in the world are struggling with. So the origin for me of this project came from my two most recent books. The first that you'll see, I believe, on the left-hand side of your screen is entitled Confronting Evil, Engaging Our Responsibility to Prevent Genocide. This book was published by Oxford in 2016, and the book is focused on issues of atrocity, genocide and atrocity prevention. And I think about that before crisis starts, while we're in the midst of crisis, and then how we rebuild societies once the crisis is over. But the part of the book that talks about before crisis is the part that focuses on what we call risk assessment. In other words, as we look at a particular country, before it falls into crisis, how do we assess the risk that country faces for crisis? 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have much quantitative, empirically grounded work in risk assessment. We seem to be continually surprised every time some episode of political violence, mass violence, crimes against humanity, genocide broke out. It was only in hindsight that we tried to figure out how it started, where did it come from, what were the preconditions. But over the past couple decades, as I argued in Confronting Evil, we've done some incredible work in terms of understanding risk and where it comes from. So that work on risk assessment from Confronting Evil found its way into my most recent book, which came out just a few months ago in 2021, A Troubled Sleep, Risk and Resilience in Contemporary Northern Ireland. So in that book, I took the risk assessment model I had developed in Confronting Evil, and I applied it specifically to the case study of Northern Ireland to look at what I argued was the heightened escalating risk posed in large part by Brexit for a country that was still very much deeply divided. And before the publication of that book, last November, just a couple of weeks before the election, I published a policy brief for the Stanley Center for Peace and Security. They're a non-governmental organization based in Muscatine, Iowa, and the Stanley Center had asked me to take the risk assessment model that I had talked about in Confronting Evil and apply it to our own country as we were approaching an election, which many of us feared would be very contentious and might actually lead to episodes of violence. So in this particular paper, I argued that the risk of violence between election and inauguration was very high. This was a follow-on to a previous paper I'd done in 2017 after the 2016 election, where I laid out some of these concerns. But in 2020, as we entered into the national election in early November, it seemed to me that a lot of what we've been thinking about in terms of risk assessment was pointing very clearly to the high probability of some form of violence somewhere between election day and inauguration. And unfortunately, as all of us know, that particular prediction didn't end up coming true on January 6th. So what I want to talk about with that background of where this work has come from, I want to talk about how we assess risk of mass violence, look at some of the issues related to governance, conflict history, economic conditions, and social fragmentation, and then come up with a conclusion of where we're at, what we're facing. As Alvin kindly said in the introduction, my specialty is not anti-Semitism. What I'm focusing on is the framework, the contextual understanding of why anti-Semitism matters in terms of how it impacts the stability or lack of stability of US society and democracy. So we'll start by looking at how we assess risk of mass violence. These are two competing metaphors we can think about when we think about risk assessment. On the left-hand side, you see a black swan. Black swans are highly unusual. We hardly ever see them in nature. When we do see them, we notice them. They seem to come out of nowhere. We can't predict them coming typically. They're just really an unusual phenomenon for us to see. I think many times when people think about assessing risk of political violence and mass violence, they think about it through this type of black swan metaphor, that when it happens, whether it is in Kenya, Ukraine, the US, Colombia, Venezuela, that when the mass violence happens, we talk about it as if it's a black swan. We didn't see it coming. We had no idea this was coming. How could something like this happen in this place, in this country, and at this time? As I said earlier, 20, maybe 30 years ago, to some degree, the black swan metaphor would have been defensible. It was really hard for us to figure out what were the best, most empirically supported factors we could look at to determine or to ascertain the level of risk. But we're no longer in that position. And I think today the better metaphor is the gray rhino on the right-hand side of the screen, that risk assessment, if we open our eyes, we see the risk in front of us. We know what we're looking for. We know what factors leave a society at risk. We know what factors increase a society's fragility. We know what factors increase society's resilience. We know these things. We have experience with these things. We have evidence with these type of risk factors. And the only way we can be blind to them is just to shut our eyes, to close our ears, to cut ourselves off from them. Because if we look at it, we can see the gray rhino right in front of us. We get a good idea of when it's ready to charge. So there really is no justifiable way that we can now say when a scene of mass violence breaks out, when genocide breaks out, there's simply no acceptable way with any integrity and honesty we can say we never saw it coming. We can always see these things coming. In 2016, in Confronting Evil, I reviewed every risk assessment model for political violence, mass violence, genocide that we had at the time. And from that model, I distilled what seemed to me to be the 20 most important risk factors or characteristics that gave us the best predictive ability for understanding when is a society at risk of this type of mass violence. And I placed those 20 factors into 4 categories: one related to governance, a second related to memory, a third to economic conditions, and a fourth related to social fragmentation. I privileged in this analysis quantitative data. By training, I'm a quantitative social psychologist, so I was looking for things that had deep empirical support. I was looking more at things that were very structural and systemic and longer term risk factors that we could have some measures of as well. So the heart of this presentation is I just want us to think together about these 4 categories of risk in the United States. The first of those is governance. These are the 5 factors I typically look at, and often I'm asked to do risk assessments or risk analyses for countries like Burundi I did last year, where the Burundian government asked me to use this model to give them some sense of where are their greatest areas of risk and fragility in their society. So when I do that, I'm looking at things like regime type, state legitimacy, how strong or weak state structures are, how much identity-based polar factionalism there is in governance, and to what degree the government engages in systematic state-led discrimination. So in my most recent book on Northern Ireland, I looked at all of these factors for Northern Ireland governance as well, trying to determine not just where the risk is, but where is a country doing well? Where does it have some points of resilience that help mitigate some of the risk we might be concerned about? So I'm not going to go through each of these one by one for the US, but I think I want to focus generally on the strength and health of democracy and democratic institutions, both globally and within the US. This is the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. I was teaching in Berlin, Germany at the Technical University in 1989, 1990, when the wall came down. I'm just going to leave that there. I was teaching in Berlin. The wall came down. You can make any connections you want to make with it. Just those 2 things are factual. So I was there. The wall came down, and I remember it ushering in this incredible spirit. And any of you who remember this, ushering in this incredible spirit of a rebirth of democracy, that countries under Soviet rule that had long been autocratic regimes now were breaking free to become democratic regimes. It wasn't always easy. It wasn't always a peaceful transition. Certainly we see that in the countries of the former Yugoslavia. But we saw this growth, this steady, almost explosive growth of countries becoming democratic over the course of time after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I still remember at the time attending conferences in the emerging field that I was getting involved in of political psychology, where political scientists and social psychologists were coming together to talk about this new world. What would this world be like with the authoritarian regimes taking a step back and democracy taking some incredible steps forward? And I don't think in 1989, 90, any of us stopped to think to say, what if this trend ever reversed again? What if at one point democracy was in retreat and authoritarian autocratic regimes were on the rise? Now, we should have understood that this would be a cyclical process, and indeed it has become that. This year, 2021, marks the first year since this time period where now authoritarian regimes outnumber democracies globally. And we see this, and I have some data here from different non-governmental organizations to give us a sense. Here's a graph from Freedom House that in 2020 looked at 41 established democracies around the world and found that 25 of them had suffered overall declines. And this has continued a progression that we'd seen in Freedom House over the past 14 years. And you see that many of those countries in decline are countries you recognize of Poland, Hungary, Thailand, Russia, India, Israel, Great Britain, and the US. And in these countries, functioning of government, freedom of expression and belief, rule of law, all of these things were in enough compromise or in enough flux that Freedom House could look at these factors that they look at annually, year after year after year, and see the extent of these declining democracies. One of the things we've seen, and we certainly have seen this in the Great Lakes region of Africa as well, but now it's become a global issue, is that when power holders are in power and realize they can't compete under democratic conditions, what we see them doing is trying to break down democracy and break down democratic institutions. So it's not an assault from outside of democracy that is disconcerting. It is that people get into power through democratic means, and once in power, if they realize they can't hold power democratically, they start to eat away at democracy from the inside. So in almost every case where we've seen democracies in decline, it's not necessarily because of overthrow. We have a few of those, but generally it's democracies being destroyed from within. The US, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit, has been a flawed democracy since 2017. And here you see in their most recent democracy index that the fully functioning democracies, Canada, some of the Scandinavian countries, Australia, New Zealand typically score high, but you see the US here is a flawed democracy. You see the hybrid regimes and authoritarian regimes that are proliferating throughout the world, sub-Saharan Africa, up into portions of the Middle East, China, Russia. So all of those things are of concern for us. In 2020, every region of the world experienced a democratic rollback. You'll see it called democratic rollback, democratic retreat, democratic backsliding, democratic deconsolidation, whatever you call it. It's democracy stepping back and autocracy starting to take its place. These tend to be very slow declines. As I said earlier, it's not as if they're happening overnight in a coup, but they're slow declines. They're like the coming of twilight, that as the light goes down, the sun goes down. If you're reading a book, your eyes adjust and your eyes adjust and your eyes adjust, but at some point you can't adjust anymore because it's completely dark. And this is how democracies are declining. Legislation by legislation by legislation, act by act by act. And at some point, it's something that we no longer recognize as a functioning democracy. In the US, this has been unfortunately with us since 2010. Another data piece here from Freedom House shows a decline of 11 points between 2010 and 2020 in the US. They cite particularly political corruption, lack of transparency in government, and punitive immigration and asylum policy. So one of the things that I've been very careful in these presentations about emphasizing is that I think we make a mistake if we trace the assault on democracy or the threats to our democracy from 2016 on. If we just apply this as something that happened during the Trump administration, we're missing a huge piece of understanding how long-standing these threats to democracy have been. Under the Trump administration, there was absolutely escalation of these threats, but the threats had been there long before that time, and we've seen much of that in the data. We have seen, for instance, a long-standing legitimacy deficit. Here you see Eurasia Group, US adults were asked how much confidence you yourself have in the presidency. And you'll see going back to the early 1990s, it peaks at 72%, but from 93, 94 on, it's almost typically each year below 50%. In 2020, only 39% of Americans said they have confidence in the presidency. So this type of legitimacy deficit of we're not sure how legitimate our government is, how legitimate their president is, this has reached a crucial point for us today. If you look on the right-hand side, you'll see that only 18% of people who registered as Trump voters still believe Joe Biden is the legitimate winner of the 2020 presidential election. 82% don't believe that. If we saw, and this is something I'll probably mention a couple times, and I apologize in advance for being repetitive with it, if we saw a statistic like that in a Latin American country, an African country, a Southeastern European country, we'd look at that and say, that country's in crisis. Something's going wrong there. That country's unstable. So we can't fall into the fiction that because it's the US, somehow we autocorrect on these things, because we don't autocorrect on them. It's a lot of work to have to correct them. So in the risk assessment I had written for the Stanley Center, this was the piece where I had concluded and said that the guardrails that we built into our constitutional democracy have been degraded. They've eroded, not just under 4 years of partisanship, polarization, and pursuit of power, but really under decades of partisanship, polarization, and the pursuit of power. And there is today, I think on both sides of the political spectrum in the US, a disintegration of trust and faith in US democratic institutions. And this is worrisome because the evidence shows us that that elevates and escalates the risk for mass violence. Many of you attending this today perhaps teach college or university, and maybe your experience is somewhat similar to mine on this. This is my 35th year of teaching at the university level. And I've never in my career had a time where so few students are interested in government, in civil service, in local, state, or federal government. A lot of that is this residual impact of, we just don't know if we trust, if we have faith in these institutions. And again, that erosion has been going on for decades, but I think is reaching some critical inflection points today. The second set of factors I'd look at when I do a risk assessment is conflict history. What's the degree of identity-related tensions in a country? Has a country had prior genocides or politicides? Does the country suffer a lot from past cultural trauma? So for instance, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where I work quite a bit, significant past cultural trauma, as there is in Northern Ireland, that I think is very much a destabilizing influence on society. What is the legacy of vengeance or group grievance? And is there a record of serious violations of international human rights and law? I think these questions have in 2021 become so important because they've been shaped now so much by social media. Oxford Internet Institute in 2019 released a report where they argued that social media was once heralded as a force for freedom and democracy. And I think many of us remember that. With the advent of social media, once we could figure out how to use it, it felt democratizing. It felt that more people would have access to more information. that more people would have access to more influence. But we've also seen the dark side of this for the role of social media in amplifying disinformation, inciting violence, and lowering levels of trust in media and democratic institutions. And here you see where the risk factors start to feed into each other. And we're having to ask ourselves hard questions about issues of freedom of speech. Is freedom of speech an absolute right? Can anyone say anything they want to say, however hateful and insightful it is, and be given a platform by Facebook or another social media group to say it? Or is freedom of speech a qualified right? Are there things that we ought not to allow to be said in those forums and those platforms because they are so hateful, because they are so insightful? I've consulted with Facebook on a couple of these issues related to genocide denial, Holocaust denial, other forms of inciting violence. And it's clear that the profit piece is more important for them, as it is for most social media groups, than it is really dealing with this notion of how destructive to a society this type of social media can be when it's unmoderated and unmonitored. So in the memory risk assessment, my concern with the US was we're blind as a country to a lot of the tensions, violence, trauma, grievances, and egregious violations of our past and how it impacts our present. We are very hesitant as a country to recognize that we live in a country founded on the twin evils of the attempted extermination of one people, the indigenous people in this country, and the importation and enslavement of another people, Africans, for slavery in this country. Without those two things, the taking of land from people that were on the land when colonizers came here, and the taking of profit off the backs of people we enslaved to produce that profit, the US doesn't exist in the form it exists. We're not the country we are without recognizing those two shameful examples of what our country was built on. But we're incredibly hesitant to want to address that. And more problematically, we're incredibly hesitant to want to address why it matters today. And some of you live in the States, and I do in New Hampshire, where we've made state law against teaching so-called divisive concepts because we don't want to expose students for various political reasons to why the past matters so much for the present. This is a particularly sore point for me because I grew up in the American South, subjected to some of this type of memory revisionist thinking. I grew up, born and raised in Georgia. Here you see an editorial from March 1955. This was a few years before I was born, but it was the first time that we see the South attempting to reframe what most all of us know as the Civil War as the War of Northern Aggression. This was in response to the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And what many people in the South began to see, the civil rights movement and the Brown decision, they saw as aggressive acts against the South in the same way that the North was aggressive against the South in the Civil War. So the result of this is that when I'm in grade school, middle school in Georgia, high school in Texas, that as I'm going through those years, what I'm taught about what you and I know as the Civil War, it's called the War of Northern Aggression. That's how I understood it. That's how it was taught. When I got to college, I went to college in Kentucky. My history professor started talking about this thing called the Civil War. I honestly didn't know what he was talking about. I had not heard it described that way until 1979 as a freshman at a small college in Kentucky. And here we see, this is a monument from nearby Woodstock, Vermont, in the memory of the boys of Woodstock and vicinity who served in the Army and Navy of the nation in the War of the Rebellion of 61 to 65. Again, that wasn't the war I understood it to be. I was taught it was a different war. People in Vermont were taught it was a different war, but all of this indicates how memory is manipulated by the people who shape memory and make memory, but also how it can leave us at risk. And I think we have to ask a question in the face of these type of policies against divisive teaching and speech. Can a country be so fragile as to collapse under the weight of its own history? Because that's how I feel when our legislature here passes this legislation saying we can't teach these types of divisive concepts around American history. It feels as if, do you really think we're so fragile as a country that we would collapse under the weight of a true, realistic understanding of how this country came to be and our history? And I think for many people in the US, they do feel that the weight of our history is enough to collapse what they see as the standing of their privilege and their power. A third area I look at risk assessment is economic conditions. I look here at low level of economic development. Particularly important is economic discrimination. To what degree is there macroeconomic stability? We were concerned about Venezuela long before the crisis happened because we knew that Venezuela's economy was predominantly built on oil. And in the case, which you knew would happen, that at some point oil prices dipped, it would hurt Venezuela incredibly. And they didn't have much other macroeconomic stability to make up for that economic hurt. And we've seen how it's devastated in many ways Venezuela today. Economic deterioration, growth of informal economies and black markets. And I think these type of economic conditions have really been exacerbated by COVID-19. I think we're still probably years away from understanding the complete global impact of COVID-19 economically. We do know that it's led to recession and depression in countries around the world. We've seen escalations in unemployment, particularly among young males in countries around the world. And that concerns us because many times those young males become drawn toward gang or criminal activity that increases instability. We've seen increases in human traffic and enslavement as a result of the economic desperation imposed in many places around the world because of COVID. And certainly we've seen both around the world and here in the US, we've seen unequal access to social services and healthcare that has always been part of the US healthcare system, but we've certainly seen that seedy underside it's completely exposed because of the pandemic. We also have, I think, significant concern in terms of a risk factor anytime we see economic inequality. And unfortunately, we do see that, as you see here, among the G7 countries, the US has the highest level of income inequality. Most starkly, that is between Black and white household income. If you look at the graph on the right-hand side, you'll see that this is a difference that has held since 1970. In absolute numbers, income has increased for both Blacks and whites, but you see the gap on median US household income, the gap has stayed pretty well consistent over nearly a 50-year period. So we worry about those situations of economic inequality because what we've seen in other countries is sometimes deprived groups resort to violence to try to address these inequalities. They're on the downside of the economy, and they see violence perhaps as their only option to try and restore some balance. But it's also true sometimes that it's privileged groups that mobilize with violence in these situations to preserve their privilege. And then the final piece, and the one that I think has the most direct connections to anti-Semitism, has to do with social fragmentation. And here I'm looking at social fragmentation is the opposite of social cohesion. So in a socially cohesive society, Generally, people have found their way toward thinking about a shared present and a shared future. There are disagreements, but you're taking steps to work toward that. In a socially fragmented society, we see deep identity-based social divisions, politically, religiously, ethnically, racially, deep identity-based social divisions. We see demographic pressures that can lead to fragmentation, unequal access to basic goods and services. We see gender inequalities, and all of these lead to a sense of political instability. Socially fragmented societies, some of them are so fragmented that they become what we call deeply divided societies. And in a deeply divided society, social identity is central to how the society thinks about themselves. They think about themselves in terms of differences and not similarities. So Rwanda had become a country that social identity was central. The focus was on what was different between Hutu and Tutsi rather than the similarities that they had shared for generations. These differences are organized along class, caste, hierarchy, faith divides, language, race, ethnicity, national cleavages, other forms of binary divisions. And in some deeply divided societies, social identity is not simply central, but it becomes very polarizing. In other words, your social identity, the group you belong to, is such a significant way of how you think about yourself, your history, your present, and your future, that it becomes so polarizing that it's as if many times you don't even get to interact with the other segment or the other side of social identity. And we can see it in a history of violence, political division, communities of fear and isolation, majority and minority conflict. And just to give you an extreme example, when I was researching my book on Northern Ireland, I was an honorary visiting research professor at Queen's University in Belfast. And in the courses I'd speak in Belfast, which are almost all at the undergraduate level, students from Northern Ireland, I'd ask them, when did you first meet someone from the other side? If you're Protestant, when did you first meet a Catholic? If you're Catholic, when did you first meet a Protestant? And I would say easily 95% of the time, these students, 18, 19, 20 years of age, said to me, the first time I met someone from the other side was when I came to university. So the first 18 years of their life, church, social settings, school, where they ate, where they shopped, all of that was completely segregated. They'd never even met someone from the other side until they came to university. I think in the US, we've seen these type of polarization of social identity in a lot of formats. Most recently, I think very much in terms of political division. Many of you probably come from families where the family has been divided because of political division in ways that it hasn't happened before, but the past several years, we've seen the depth of some of those divisions. We even see it, I think, incredibly in where we choose to live, if we have choices to live, and how that divides itself out. Earlier this year, the New York Times did a piece with several major metropolitan areas where they looked at the breakdown of where Democrats and Republicans live. And we're used to thinking about red states and blue states, but here they were just looking at the city level. And they said at the city level, and here's one example of Detroit, we see the red-blue distinctions at the city level, that who people are choosing, if they have choice, to live by, who people are ending up living by, tend to be people more sympathetic to their own political beliefs. And you see this in metropolitan area after area after area. And our concern in risk assessment is that one of the things we've seen is when we have these deeply divided societies with deep social fragmentation, that it leaves a potential for violent conflict, that there's a well-entrenched fault line in a deeply divided society that is, as Adrian Guelke says, recurrent and endemic and contains a potential for violence between segments. And I like that image of the fault line, that even if the fault line is not active, it's there. But the fault line becomes active in the US with shootings of unarmed Black men by police, with elections. These type of things bring out the fault lines. When things happen related to Israel and Palestine, we see the fault lines around anti-Semitism start to rear their head in US rhetoric as well. So it's this potential for violent conflict that we worry about in the US. And we seem to finally be coming to a recognition of this. The FBI director said earlier in March, domestic terrorism threat in the US is metastasizing. We had opened 2,000 domestic terrorism inquiries in recent years. Again, this is not anything new necessarily. I have the opportunity to work often with federal law enforcement agencies on human rights training. So I'll go a couple times a year to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia, or Charleston, South Carolina, working with ICE agents and other federal agents on human rights issues. And they've always said, it's domestic terrorism is our biggest threat. That thing is going to kill us. But for politicians, international terrorism sells. When we can say the terrorist is someone over there who looks different than we do, who talks differently than we do, who believes differently than we do, that's an easier sell politically. To look internally at domestic terrorists who go to the state fairs we go to, who pull for the football teams we pull for, who are part of the fabric of this society, that's something we've been hesitant to do. But I think after January 6th, at least we have more federal law enforcement attention directed that way. We, I think, are dealing with a military that has a history with white nationalism. This is something, here's a commentary written actually by 4 colleagues from West Point, the US Military Academy in West Point, who have said, we've always known the military has some disturbing connections with white nationalism, and particularly with Christian white nationalism. But we're recognizing this at a level that we haven't seen it before. And we see in our military both some resistance to vaccines and vaccine hesitancy, but we also see this tie with Christian white nationalism that has many people in the US military concerned about our forces and the potential risks that they could expose us to. As many of you know, 2020, the ADL found over 2,000 anti-Semitic incidents. That's the 3rd highest year on record. Unfortunately, one of the clear signs of social fragmentation and the type of deep divisions we've talked about is isms of all types, now that the fault line is opened, have that opportunity to pop up, have that opportunity to propagate. And unfortunately, anti-Semitism has been one of those that we have seen increased numbers of. We've seen increases in political rhetoric and social rhetoric and freedom and permission to speak in ways that are clearly anti-Semitic. And all of these things, again, pose a degree of internal threat. So when I looked at social fragmentation, this was the risk factor that was most concerning for me, because what we really are worried by with social fragmentation is when groups start to see each other as an intractable or permanent existential threat. When that group is a threat to my existence, this is when we start to get on the verge of political violence or even mass violence, because now we see it as a zero-sum game. Their existence is a threat to my privilege. And now the question is, how do I deal with the threat? And how power holders deal with threat, we've seen historically, has not typically been compromise. It has been persecution, it's been discrimination, it's been exclusion, and sometimes has been extermination. So when I looked at January 6th, after I'd written this paper in November, it felt to me that the threat the insurrectionists were responding to was a threat to their privilege, a threat to the privilege of being Christian in a diverse nation, a threat to the privilege of being white in an increasingly diverse nation, and the threats to those privileges, to be Christian, to be white, I think they were responding to because they felt it to be an existential threat. And that's the flesh and blood consequence of living in a deeply divided society, is how people respond when they see these types of threats. Several years ago, Taylor Branch is a historian who wrote about the American Civil Rights Movement. He said the great challenge of the Civil Rights Movement was this question: are you going to choose whiteness or democracy? Christianity or democracy? Privilege or democracy? And I think, unfortunately, we're still struggling with that question. What does it really truly mean to be a diverse democratic country? And what does it mean to the privileges that some groups hold who they feel to be under existential threat? So the conclusion I have, and then we can get to your questions, is, in the aftermath of January 6th, commentator after commentator, including President-elect Biden, kept saying some refrain of, this is not who we are. This is not who we are. And I did, and I still do disagree with that. This is exactly who we are. This is who we've become, not because of 4 years of a tumultuous presidential administration, but because for decades, decades, and decades of how our country has developed, this is exactly who we are. And as I said earlier, if risk analysts were noticing these same trends anywhere else in the world, it'd be clear. Alarms would be raised. But the cold recognition is that we're not a failed state or a failing state, but I do think the US is a fragile state, and I think we're a flailing one. I think in some ways we're closer to breakdown than we are to break through. So this is who we are. It's not who we aspire to be. I think all of us want to be something different, but unfortunately, it's who we are now. And I think in many ways, January 6th happened here because we did not believe it could happen here. We thought it couldn't happen here. And I think that opened the gates for it to happen. I think of greatest concern for those of us who work in risk assessment and live and work in the US is that one of the things we know from history is that once a country has engaged in political violence, and January 6th was political violence, once a country is engaged in political violence, it's much easier for them to do it again. It opens a door that says this is part of the way we do politics, is we can do it in ways that are violent. And once that door has been open, it's a difficult one for us to shut. James Baldwin was an African-American author who said, not everything in its face can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I think that's the reality of what we face in the US today. We're a fragile state, we're a flailing state, and we can't change that until we recognize it, until we face it. President Biden, in one of his first addresses, even threw this challenge to us, that our children and grandchildren are going to be doing their doctoral theses on the issue of who succeeded, autocracy and democracy. That's what's at stake here. We've got to prove democracy works. And I want to take you back to 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Again, if you had told any of us at that time that 40 years from then, we'd still be wondering who's going to succeed, autocracy or democracy, we would have thought, that's crazy. We know democracy has won now. But we know democracy is a very difficult thing to build and to sustain. And I'll close with this. I have a good friend who's fond of saying, true democracy is never absolutely sure of itself. And what he means by that is true democracy is always questioning itself. It's always protecting itself. It's always trying to build itself. And when we don't, when we let those safeguards down, that's when we leave open the type of windows of risk of mass violence that we saw, unfortunately, manifest on January 6th.